Let's begin. First thing, you can probably hear it, I'm not feeling well. I have some parasite that has decided to take up its meaningful existence within my chest. So please forgive me, my volume might cut out occasionally. If you need me to repeat anything, please don't hesitate to put up your hand, all right? And I'll do my best to try and not let this interfere with the presentation of material. All right, so what I want to do is do a schematic review of where we have gotten to. Okay, thank you, Rebecca. A schematic review of where we've gotten to in the phenomenology of relevance realization. And that's my way of building a case, the elegance side of the plausibility argument, namely that I can give you, and I hope you know what I mean by this now, an elegant explication of what meaning means. And so we start with, of course, relevance realization and the fact that it is fundamentally recursive, that it feeds back on itself, it takes itself as something that it processes. This especially shows up in things like insight. And then that leads to what we talked about in terms of fundamental framing. This fundamental connectedness between the embodied brain and the world that affords both the disclosure of a meaningful world and the genesis of a cognitive agency, your egoic self. And we noted all of the pre-features of fundamental framing, how it's pre-egoic, etc., pre-empirical, pre-rational, all that stuff. And therefore, why it is so precisely fundamental. We then talked about how that fed into some interlacing landscapes. The salience landscape, right, and the presence landscape. And the depth landscape. And these are all interacting with each other. And that gives you the significance landscape, or at least the possibility of it. Fundamental framing also went to the three dimensions, which had an overlay with the three kinds of love. Types of patterns and the three types of knowing. If you remember, those are procedural and propositional, and they come together in perspectival. And of course, there's a deep connection between the perspectival knowing and having a salience landscape. There's a deep connection between the three kinds of love and your significance landscape. So all of these are feeding together, and then as I mentioned, this feeds into the three levels. The level of making connections, maybe I'll do it this way, logos, that's self-organizing, both in the sense of creating a basis for logical order and logistical disposition of resources. Logos as a common source of logistics and logic in a self-organizing manner. And this is the level at which we're making connections. And then this is noesis. This is the level at which we are experiencing connections. And then there's mythos. This is the level at which we are sharing connections. And we talked about the structure of each one of these, how this has relevance and reverence and resonance and remembrance. And then this has insight, mindsight, hindsight, and foresight. And this has symbols, stories, souvenirs, and various shows. And we'll come back to all of this. And last time I said, I think my diagram was a little bit misleading because in my mind I was thinking of all of this feeding into this, and I called this religio, and that's not incorrect. But a better way sort of drawing the backlit would be like that. That's religio. Because religio is the machinery of this fundamental connectedness. And that's the machinery. And what I've been trying to argue is that religio is what we're talking about when we're using meaning as a metaphor for something. This is what it's a metaphor for. So what I want to do today is two things. I read a book by Thomas Mann called The Magic Mountain, and the main character, it's a big book by Thomas Mann, who's relentlessly German, right? It's a very good book, but the main character is Hans Castorp, and all through the book he's slowly dying of tuberculosis. I feel like Hans Castorp right now. I feel like it's sort of, I got a fever, my chest is not part of me anymore, so please forgive me if I keep coughing, I apologize. What I want to do today is fill in. We've talked a lot about this machinery, and we've talked a lot about this machinery inside the mindset. But we need to talk a little bit. We've talked about some of that machinery. We've talked about narrative and things, but I want to unpack the mythos machinery, because what I'm going to try and build towards is the sacredness landscape. Sacredness landscape. And what I need to do in order to do that is to fill out how mythos functions, and then how that mythos can function in the generation of a sacredness landscape, and what the functionality of that sacredness landscape is, what it does for us. Okay? And then when that's done, I think we'll have enough of the tools we need to go back to talking about the meaning crisis, because we can talk about what happens when all this machinery is disrupted. Okay? And that will, again, be part of the discussion about how the sacredness machinery is functional. All right, so we expand mythos. We remember the mythos has these elements in it. It has symbols that help us to share insights, particular kind of insights, right? Particular kind of symbols. We have stories, right? And that helps us, right, to track foresight. And then we have various shows, especially rituals and ceremonies, in order to share mindsight. And then, of course, we have souvenirs in order to share hindsight. So I want to talk about each one of these components and expand it out. So a symbol, the way I'm going to use it is the way it's typically used in cultural anthropology, religious studies, theology, because it has a particular function there, which is the function I'm trying to capture. So work by Ricoeur and Paul Tillich and people like that have basically informed this. But also people like, as you'll see, Geertz and anthropology, people like this informing this notion of what I mean by a symbol. So a symbol is a metaphor. And I think this is also Jung's notion of a symbol too, although saying what Jung meant was not an easy thing to do. So you remember, I taught you earlier about what a metaphor is and how it functions, and the notion of aptness and the tension within a metaphor, and, right, and how it causes a reframing. It's supposed to engender insight. So I'm not going to repeat all that because I gave you that lecture already. What I want to talk about is a symbol being a specific kind of metaphor. Okay? So symbols are metaphors in which we are using something picturable, something we can hold in our mind as a metaphor for something that we cannot directly hold in our mind, that is nevertheless important to us. So, let me give you an example. Without using the word justice, hold justice in your mind. Don't just put the word justice in there, because that's not what I'm talking about. Justice. How do you hold justice in your mind? How can you? It's this abstract, very complex thing. Now, what some of you might have done, in fact, I suspect that a significant proportion of you did, is you might have imagined you know, Lady Justice, blindfolded, holding the scales. Right? And what's interesting, right, is what that is allowing you to do. That is allowing you to activate your sense of justice. The problem with a lot of these things that we care about is they have aspects of propositional, procedural, and perspectival knowing. It's very hard, in fact, to put the procedural and the perspectival into language. It's very hard to hold their complex relations in your very limited working memory. So, a couple of examples. Many of you know how to tie your shoes, tie your shoelaces. I'm sure of that. I can look around, I've got a lot of evidence for it. Right? Have a small child and try to teach them how to tie their shoelaces. And you will realize very quickly how little of your know-how you can actually put into words. I remember when I was teaching my older son, Jason, to ride a bicycle, this became very prominent in my mind. You know, at that time he was my only child. I'm putting my only child. What a bizarre thing we do, right? We take your children, we put them on this very unstable surface, very little protection. We right, put something on his head, fine, and then you send them off, often, you know, at a roadside, which is one of the most dangerous inventions in North America, because roadsides are filled with cars, they kill tens of thousands of people every year. And so I'm chasing after my son with all of this in my mind, and I'm saying very useless things to him. I'm saying, keep your balance. Look around, not too much. Pedal a bit faster, but not too fast. Keep your balance. And it's all so grotesquely inadequate, because a lot of our know-how does not readily translate into knowing that. It's ineffable. It's hard to put into words. Same thing with your perspectival knowing. Knowing what it is like to be a father, what the significance landscape of a father is like. It is a very complex, dynamic logos to it. Right? There's a very complex, dynamic, structural, functional organization. And we already talked about how the structural, functional organization, right, is very hard to put into words. And then secondly, a significance landscape, right? We don't have good language for that. So what I'm suggesting to you is, right, justice is the same kind of thing. We have beliefs about justice, that's propositional. We also know how to try to interact with people in a way that's just. And we also know what it is to take up the perspective of justice on a situation. But that is very hard to put into, right, a thought, to hold it in your mind. And so instead what we do is we have something that is a metaphor for it. Something that tries to capture or at least activate some of that know-how, right, with the balance. Some of the perspectival knowing, because justice is a woman. Why, by the way? Because justice should have some, I mean, this is sexist, but most of our symbols are, but justice should have some element of compassion to it. Right? And, right, she's blind. That's trying to get you to take the perspectival knowing of impartiality. So what this symbol does is it tries to trigger, metaphorically, aspects, right, crucial trigger points of the propositional knowing, the procedural knowing, and the perspectival knowing, so you can sort of hold that in your mind, because you can't directly hold justice in your mind. That's a symbol. A symbol is a metaphor so that you can activate the three kinds of knowing and keep a subject or a topic in mind that you normally cannot directly keep in mind. That's why symbols are often irreplaceable. Okay, so that's what a symbol is.
Excuse me.
Yes?
But then how can a symbol sort of like induce insight?
How does it introduce insight? It induces a kind of insight into, it might make you realize something about the nature of justice. So the idea about such a symbol is you're supposed to, when you invoke it, it is supposed to, like you're in a particular situation, by inducing the symbol, it is supposed to put you into the right frame of mind so that you insightfully size the situation up in a more just manner.
Okay. So it's sort of like when sitting in a court, there's usually something about justice. It's sort of like driving or something. Okay, you should be in the mindset of
Right.
justice rather than reading morning newspapers.
That's right, that's right. Yes, Alan, very loudly because you're at the back.
When you say like those three types of object, those three, does that bear any relationship between the let's read them?
I don't think so. You mean the three kinds of knowing?
Yes.
No.
Not just three types of knowing, but all of them, because there seems to be three types of them. Like that's how it works.
Oh, well, there's lots of threes, is that what you're saying? Yeah, I don't know if the threes map onto the Platonic threes. I toyed with that idea that the monster might be procedural and the man might be sort of perspectival, or sorry, and the lion might be sort of perspectival and the man might be propositional. But I'm not happy with that yet, so I wouldn't make that move yet. Promise.
Okay, I guess I'm just asking about. So, if we hold a concept in mind, like justice, what? So there are the ideas that there are associated, sort of a host of triggers that we have there, right? Along a bunch of different dimensions, right?
Right.
That we measure.
Yeah, and that's what I mean by holding in mind. I don't mean, you can't sort of think justice. You can think the word, and you can think some proposition. You can't sort of think, this is a kind of a Platonic argument. You can't think it directly. So what you have to, like, you can activate it. You can have it informing your cognition.
Well, in terms of the Platonic notion, there is being here trying to approximate that ideal of justice, do you mean, or?
I think so. I mean, I think what you're trying to do is create what Plato would call a kind of understanding of justice, which isn't the same thing as just being able to make statements about justice or do just things, but somehow have them coordinated together so that you realize what justice is.
And then, in terms of the phenomenology, phenomenology kind of seems like a fluency with the concept. So not to invoke like a language of thought or anything there.
Sure.
Just when you for me, when I think of justice, I don't necessarily associate it with posted imagery or episodes or something like that. But more so just a phenomenology of fluency, of like readiness or poisedness to recognize.
Right, but I would ask you that you to reflect upon the fact that that fluency and poisedness was probably educated into you through the use of these kinds of symbols.
Sure.
Just to clarify what a symbol is, are numbers and letters and words all hieroglyph symbols?
They can be if they're used this way, but I'm not using them in the Peircean sense as symbols. So standardly, I wouldn't call a number a symbol, I would call it a sign.
What's the difference between sign and symbol?
A sign just directly refers to something, right? It's just something that points to something else. This has the particular function of trying to, this notion I'm trying to get you to see of holding something in your mind and not directly think.
So the word justice written out, that holds justice in your mind? And
It could, but typically all it's doing is for many people, just doing an empty reference. It's not, as I was saying to Zyphon, typically for many people putting them into the state of mind of being just. Whereas the symbol is trying to create that kind of insight in your cognition. It's trying to get you into a state that you're seeing into justice, if I can put it that way.
there's more cues.
Yes, and there's more cues and they're coordinated, and it taps into some sort of primordial attachments. We tend to have deep attachments to mother figures, etc., things like that. There was another hand up. Alex?
I wanted to ask, this kind of plays off the last question, whether a symbol's features necessarily have to relate to what it signifies. For example, the Nazi swastika is a stand-in for Russia. We understand that.
Well, I mean, the thing about that is pictorial symbols, right, even the features, did matter to the Nazis. I mean, so the Nordic and Christian associations with the swastika were important triggers for what the Nazis were trying to convey. And then, of course, the association also with the Aryans in northern India. So a lot of that is actually being triggered by that. And yes, I do think that the swastika is, in that sense, a symbol. It is a symbol for, something that in fact was almost, I mean, this is the thing about Nazism. If you try to get clear on what it actually was, you can't. It keeps slipping away. It doesn't stabilize. I mean, it has a lot of noxious elements to it that we can point, but what it was, it's very hard to articulate, very hard to articulate. So I think, in fact, I'm trying to think about the moral status of what I'm saying. The Nazis needed the swastika. They really needed it to, in a sense, hold Nazism in the minds of the people. And they needed Hitler as a living symbol for Nazism as well, to hold that in people's minds. Because outside of those symbols, holding that in your mind was difficult, not only because it was procedural and perspectival relevance, but because it was very inchoate. Is that okay? So now I want to talk about some of the functionality of these symbols, right? Especially as they are going to contribute towards the sacredness landscape. So we've got a metaphor for basically this triggering, and you'll come back, you'll see what I mean more by this in a few minutes. This triggering, right, integration, the three kinds of knowing. And what that affords is that it affords this holding in mind so that you can be in a cognitive and active cognitive relationship to something. And what that does is it informs your mind. It gives you insight into the phenomenon in an active sense. So symbols are very important to us. Now, for some of us, the symbols are becoming dead, right? And we're losing some of that activity. So when people are married, they'll wear a ring on this finger, and it's metal, okay? And a lot of people have lost the symbol. Why this finger, by the way? Close to my heart, the heart line. Okay, and I'm binding it. Why am I binding it with metal? Especially gold. Okay, you like gold. Why do you like gold?
Because they are sort of like, in a sense, very, you cannot, like gold, they sort of stays constant. It's
Right, it's constant, it doesn't tarnish, it's also bright and yellow like the sun, which makes you happy. So constant happiness, it's bound here, right? Okay? So there's all of that symbolism. That was enacted by people. People have sort of lost that, and now it's just largely a token. Right? But that was the original symbolism of it. And the idea was, by wearing the ring, when you saw the ring, or others saw the ring, it was supposed to trigger a lot of that machinery, and that was supposed to keep you in the right frame of mind to help sustain your marriage. Okay, now let's start talking then about some of the functionality of symbols. Like, what are some of the effects it has on cognition, whether it's doing this? So symbols, in the way that I'm using the term, right, tend to be ecstatic. And I'm using the Greek spelling and the Greek word because I don't want to use the English word, because the English word has degenerated. The English word is ecstasy, which either means a drug or a really amazing orgasm or something like that. And I'm not talking about that. Now the thing about the drug and the orgasm is they actually point back to the original and important meaning. Okay? This is ecstasis, to stand beyond yourself, right? So what symbols do, right? Stasis is to stand and ek is beyond, so to stand beyond yourself. So symbols are supposed to help you to transcend yourself. By provoking this kind of insight, they are supposed to take you out of, right, your normal, your habitual, your often egocentric state of mind. They are designed to get you to stand beyond yourself, to draw you beyond yourself, to draw you into a more encompassing frame. I think Jung had a lot of insights about this. He thought all symbols, and I don't agree tightly with Jung, but you read broadly, that symbols were like metaphors where we held one part in our conscious mind and it pointed to aspects of the unconscious mind. And of course that maps onto this in certain ways. And the whole point of the symbol was so that the conscious mind, through its interaction with the unconscious mind, could break out of its narrow, habituated forms of frame. Although I'm not espousing a Jungian theory here, I think many theorists have come to that idea that that is one of the central functions of symbols, in this kind of ecstatic function, getting you to draw, for you to step beyond, or you draw beyond yourself. And in that sense, right, symbols are putting us into the situation where we are confronting a more encompassing perspective than the one that we are normally in. That's what I mean by ecstasis. So it's very similar to the situation that Spencer is in when he is confronting a problem, and I have a much larger perspective on the problem that he is also encountering and dealing with. That leads me to the next aspect of symbols. They're participatory. And this is a fundamental way in which they differ from just signs. So, to give you an example, I want you to consider this thing as standing for love and kissing someone. Okay? So, this actually doesn't even look like a heart. Okay? It's kind of weird where this came from. It's got a weird history. Okay. Okay. That really doesn't, for most people, trigger the state of mind that is supposed to be conducive of love. It doesn't participate in the phenomena that it points to. It just points to it. But symbols, because of this, because they're trying to create a particular state of mind in you, they are participatory. They're trying to create your experience of the phenomena, your engagement with it. So a kiss is supposed to engender, the mental framework that is conducive to love. And in that way, it doesn't just point at love, it is participatory in it. And what that means is that symbols are very much relying on this machinery in an interesting way. So this will take me to another kind of knowing that people are starting to talk about, which I think is important, participatory knowing. So participatory knowing is when you know something, because of the way in which you put yourself into an aspect of your cognition that is self-organizing, that is running, that you're not deliberately directing. And because of that, what that does is that allows you to, as I say, experience the phenomena that you're thinking of rather than just thinking about it. So, a classic example of participatory knowing, it's kind of funny and humorous, is, and participatory knowing can be of all three kinds. Procedural, you're kind of knowing for falling asleep is participatory. You can't sort of, I'm going to sleep now. It's not something you assert or do. What do? You have to sort of set your mind so that it's conducive to these processes that are largely self-organizing to take on a life of their own and transform your cognition and consciousness until you're asleep. That's why if you really want to go to sleep and you try hard to go to sleep, what is the last thing you're capable of actually doing? Going to sleep. Okay? So, and of course, it's the same thing for waking up. And it's also why we use metaphors, we use these kinds of metaphors for love. We fall in love. Because when you fall, you do some actions, and then you give yourself over to a process that is self-organizing and takes you along. That's why love is participatory in that way. And what I'm saying is, this is what the symbols are. They're participatory. They're designed to get you to give your cognition into these self-organizing processes so that you can experience, right, the phenomena rather than just pointing your thoughts at it. So, when you see the heart, I think for most people that doesn't happen, but when you kiss somebody, right, the point isn't just to press your face against their face, like, now I am done. Right, the point is, right, you're trying to get, and we'll come back to this is a very Taoist notion. You're trying to get, right, to a place where you're triggering a bunch of processes in you and also in the other person in a self-organizing manner that you then flow with and participate in. Now, one of the problems in our culture, of course, is that as you start to understand what I mean by a symbol, you're starting to realize that we're losing symbols. Part of the reason why the Nazis were so successful is because of their ability to rejuvenate symbols for people. Okay, ecstatic and participatory. And these are all interrelated. Although I'm explaining to them analytically, they're all interrelated because they're all ways of talking about this holding in mind idea and the triggering of insight and informing. So this goes to a notion from Michael Polanyi, who talks about, and we talked about his work. Remember when we did the tapping experiment? And we talked about that you have sort of your subsidiary awareness onto your focal awareness. Do you remember that? Yes or no? Yes, good. Okay, some of you remember it. Some of you are pretending that you remember. Okay, so we talked, remember, you're feeling through your fingers to the bottle. You can actually step back and look at your fingers. Now do you remember that? Okay, so what Polanyi says is in our everyday cognition, this is what we're actually interested in. This is where our interest lies. Okay? So the point of our attention is to realize the focal object, to get to that product in our mind. Is that okay? But what happens in the symbol is we use the same process, but what we're actually interested in is the process of integration, the process of fusion, not the object itself. So he gives the example of an American looking at the American flag. So the point isn't to sort of make out the flag, because they've seen the flag 1,000 times before, right? And they're not going to use the flag for anything. It's not like where's the bottle? All you do when you see the flag is continue to see the flag. Okay? But what does it do? Well, what it does is it takes a lot of inchoate stuff, feelings about, patriotism and belonging, certain emotions, certain memories, certain episodes, certain way of holding your body. And what it does is it integrates them all together. It actually fuses them into the experience of seeing the flag. So what the function of the flag is to actually trigger this integration process for its own sake. Because what that actually helps to do is to make, you into a different kind of person. It helps, and think about all of this again, see how this all fits together. It helps turn a non-patriot into a patriot by the use of symbolic means. And I hope you guys are getting it, and this is deliberate on my part. Although I'm saying everything that can be naturalistically explained, you see how symbols have a lot of the features that sort of show up in fantasy literature as magic? Because you're using these things, and what you're doing is drawing people beyond themselves, actually creating the phenomena, turning a person from one type of person into another person. It's very powerful stuff. So that's a really important function. But I think along with that, I would add another I. It goes back to this, the ecstasis and the participatory, and feeds into that. Remember I said that when I'm looking at a symbol, it's like I'm engaging with a more encompassing perspective than my everyday perspective. So when a Christian is looking at Jesus or the cross, they're invoking a perspective that, right, is more encompassing than their everyday perspective. It's supposed to trigger compassion and agape in them. Obviously, it's taking all these different aspects and integrating them together, right? Because you can hold this in your mind, and it's helping to turn a non-Christian into a Christian. It's doing all of that, which is, by the way, why if you're not a Christian, you shouldn't wear crosses. It's deeply insulting. It's wrong. Okay? It's offensive. I'm not a Christian. I'm not defending Christianity, but it's wrong. You shouldn't trivialize other people's symbols just for fashion reasons. That's inappropriate. But because the person is put into this perspective that they are participating in, that's not external to them, right? Remember what happens with Spencer? Spencer starts to imitate my perspective on his perspective. Eventually, what does he do? Remember we talked about this? He internalizes my perspective on his perspective, and that's how he grows his metacognition. It's how he overcomes the biases and the limited goals of his perspective. Symbols do the same thing. They allow you to internalize broader perspectives than your own because they are connected to the ecstatic and participatory and integrative nature of symbols. So Alex, I think you're getting a better idea of what I meant when I said the Nazis needed the swastika. They needed Hitler. And I think, again, I am not trying to praise him in any moral manner, because I'm not trying to do that. But part of Goebbels' genius was to realize that. Last element. The symbols are convergent, which again lines up with all of these. All of these overlap and interpenetrate each other very, very powerfully. What do I mean to say that a symbol is convergent? It sort of does culturally what integration does psychologically. So think of Athena. Athena, right, stands for many different things. She stands for, Athens, patriotism, wisdom, warfare, commerce, and all of those are deeply interconnected. And in Athena, you can draw them all together. You can make them all talk to each other, reinforce each other. And so symbols tend to be convergent. So again, think of the cross. What does the cross do for the Christian? Well, the cross brings up ideas about suffering, but also redemption. It brings out ideas of agape and compassion. It represents the intersection of the horizontal domain of man and the vertical intersection of God, right? Linking this earth and heaven. It does all of these perspectival, it's doing all of that. And it's drawing all of those different elements, right, of a Christian community together. It gives them a connection point. It's a nexus point for all of these different aspects, and it holds them together. So not only does it hold things together in people, not only does it hold something in your mind, it holds things together like in a group or in a community or in a culture. Now, if you sort of treat these two eyes as one eye, you have an acronym for remembering this. A mnemonic. Symbols are epic. Okay? So that's a way of trying to remember it. EPIC. They're epic. Yes.
What's the difference between integrative and convergent?
Because I think convergence has, like I said, integrative is a psychological, having to do with how the individual is bringing different elements together. And I'm trying to use convergence as a cultural parallel. It brings different aspects of your culture or your environment together for you. Okay. So that's, I think, why symbols are so important for mythos, so important for sharing connections. Because they have, this functionality to them. So here's a question I want you to reflect on for a moment. And open your mind and heart and try to take it as existentially serious as you can. What, notice the words I'm using, right? What significant symbols do you have? So, that's what I mean about how this is helping us to get more specific about what's being lost in the meaning crisis. Many of us, notice what I had to do. I had to refer to, for many of us, and I don't mean any insult here, I clearly don't, right? I had to refer to a symbol that no longer works for many of us, Christian symbols. But if symbols are performing all this important functionality, and and helping to bring the significance landscape into your mythos, not having significant symbols is a gap. It's a gap in this functionality. All of this isn't being done very well for you anymore. All right, so that's what I'm going to mean by a symbol. And again, it's giving you another aspect of what is meant by meaning and another way of seeing what has been lost. And as I said to Alex, it also makes you understand why the symbolism of Nazism was so important to its success. Okay, so stories. We've already talked about narrative, so I'm going to first of all remind you of some of that and why narrative are so important. So most of it's going to be reminding, and I'll just go over it and flesh it out for you a little bit. So remember, the whole point of narrative is, right, what it does is it helps you to enhance your ability to pick up on other people's mental states. Remember Daniel Pluto? Because what it does is it gets you to look for, do you remember this when we talked about belief, desire, psychology? Yes or no? Some of you do. Okay, it's in your notes. Okay. So the idea is, in addition to, saying you have this belief and you have this desire, I have to put that into the context, the circumstances. I have to know your character. I have to know, the course of events. If this is a turning point. Basically, I use narrative to pick up, right, on that. And basically, the idea is to try and track the course of people's minds so that I can determine what is the crucial turning point, the kairos in interacting with it. That related to Alicia Guerraro's point, remember? That what narrative does is put our mind in sort of the correct way of being active. It activates the mind in the way that is best for tracking dynamical systems in the world. Remember that. So what narrative does is to get your mind working in sort of the best way for tracking dynamical systems. And it also, I believe, I also talked about Siegel's work, that narrative is what's most predictive of attachment, precisely because it affords both that mindsight ability, that foresight ability, and that ability to pick up on complex systems. And we talked about the narrative practice hypothesis, and how it fundamentally changes the way you appropriate and internalize time. That's the power of story. That's why stories are so very, very important for sharing connections. Because all of that machinery gets trained and shared, gets trained between people, and gets shared between people via narrative, via story. So that's what I mean by stories. Okay. Now rituals are very important. Rituals and ceremony, all the ways in which we're sort of showing. Because, as I argued last time, one of the main functions of ritual is to get us all into a shared state. Shared state. That's why we like to go to sporting events, or we like to share food together, all that kind of stuff. So what it does is it enhances our ability to get into mindset resonance. Rituals have a couple of other really important features to them that it's very powerful functionality. if you're interested in some deeper aspects of ritual, there's a lot of really important literature on it, obviously, in cultural anthropology. Leo and myself, for Beacon for our 2016, we talk about this stuff in connection to issues that are relevant to this class, Buddhism. So that's why I'm putting it on 2016. Because we have this hypothesis. We think that ritual is the common ancestor of mindfulness and hypnosis. Specific type of ritual, typically kind of shamanic rituals, but ritual behavior is probably, right, the source of both of these kinds of practices, these types of practices. And this goes to some work done by Matt Rosano and others. The thing about ritual is it's already biologically set into us. So many animals already have ritual behavior. Because one of the main functions of ritual is to deal with, right, a problem that cuts across species, namely, how do you interact intimately with strangers? Right? Which many species need for sexual reproduction. So there's rituals, right, that are designed to do that. Now, the thing about human beings is what we can do is we can take biological programming and we can exact it. We can use it for cultural purposes. That's one of our hallmarks. Rosano argues that, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, there's a period right before the Upper Paleolithic transition, about 100,000, 70,000 BCE, that we've got pretty good evidence that there was a huge ecological crisis going on in the species, like for the species in Africa. And the response, one of the responses was that we developed extensive trade networks to try and trade both information and resources as a way of responding to this radical change in the environment. It's one of the first clear evidence of sort of a broad-scale cultural response to an ecological crisis, which of course is kind of precedent today, right? And the thing with trade networks is you need ways of doing a lot of important things. You need ways for, right, people who are not kinship and do not spend a lot of time to each other to be able to interact intimately, closely, and safely with each other. And so ritual behaviors are designed to try and do that. You also need behaviors to strengthen your ties to your own group, because, right, as you get involved with other groups in different locations, there's a challenge to your loyalty to your particular group. So initiation rituals become much more important. Rituals that indicate your commitment to the group you belong to. He then goes on to argue, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, that those rituals were exacted by shamans and other processes that were already taking place. It was probably rituals around fire, and fire has to do with sort of the ways in which you're focusing your attention, right, concentrating on a particular thing, etc. Now, what we argued, making use of McNamara and a bunch of other people on ritual, is that ritual, right, has a lot of these features. So ritual decenters you. So when you're engaging in a ritual, very often what you do is you give up your agency. Right? So for example, think of a priest performing a religious ritual. The priest will speak, but the priest is not speaking on his behalf, so it's only still his, right? Speaking on behalf of the community or God. So there's a decentering. It's no longer an egocentric production. The authority for the event is no longer centered in the ego of the actor. It's decentered. And that's what rituals do. Now that, of course, is a central feature of hypnosis. What happens in hypnosis is a decentering process in which you basically make use of your participatory abilities. This is another example. You can, right, allow the self-organizing aspect of your mind, right, and the fact that you internalize other people's perspectives to give them sort of the directorship over your consciousness and cognition. There's no Svengali thing. People can't sort of take you over or stuff like that. Right? I mean, they could, you've been drugged and operant conditioning in some horrible Manchurian Candidate style of movie today. But generally, all hypnosis is ultimately self-hypnosis. You're basically internalizing and participating through another person in order to decenter your consciousness and your cognition. But rituals also can have a huge mindfulness aspect, because what matters in the ritual isn't actually what you're doing, but how you're doing it. The end result is usually pretty useless. Right? The point about a ritual, right, is that you have to do it in exactly the right way. It requires that you shift attention on the process and value the process. You pay attention to how you're paying attention. But you can't do it in a way that will disrupt your behavior. So rituals also have a huge aspect of mindfulness. And these two fit each other. If you teach hypnosis, and so Norman Garb talks about this, actually in the same anthology in which this paper is published. Very often the techniques by which meditation is taught, some of you have taken meditation with me, the way the teacher, myself, for example, is teaching the people is very, very similar to how you induce hypnosis. It's almost exactly the same. The processes you take people through, the way you speak, right? And when you have things like guided meditation, the boundary between meditation and hypnosis it disappears, it dissolves. So, hypnosis helps to induce mindfulness. But of course, mindfulness, right, can also keep you well focused and following something very, very carefully, which helps to strengthen the hypnotic aspect. In ritual, these two things are working together. So for me, a clear example of this is when I'm doing Tai Chi. So when I'm doing Tai Chi, right, I'm doing these rhythmic, almost musical, melodic patterns, right, and I'm doing them for their own sake. When I'm done Tai Chi, I end up where I started. Nothing was accomplished. I didn't build anything. I didn't procure anything. I didn't produce anything. I move, I do all this movement, and then I end up where I started. From a utilitarian point of view, it's completely absurd and useless. But what's happening is, I'm using a lot of things that are triggering. You have to give yourself over to the form. It's very participatory. When you're moving in Tai Chi, right, you have to feel like you're being moved as much as you are moving. It is participatory. It decenters you, and you get you have to almost go into let the form hypnotize you. But it's also this tremendous mindfulness practice. You have to be very aware of your awareness. You have to pay attention to how you're paying attention. I think yoga does that also. I've been doing yoga with my girlfriend for a while now, and it's clearly that kind of thing. And there's huge aspects of when people are practicing it that are highly ritualized in nature. Now, part of the argument of Matt Rosano and McNamara and other people, and Leo and myself, is that this is a very powerful psychotechnology. The same thing that you see in the cultural anthropologists. It's a very powerful psychotechnology for sharing like mental states with each other. Really powerful way. So that's why, that is part of why you see people doing Tai Chi together in groups, because of that participatory nature, that sharing. It also has a martial art function. It's supposed to open your peripheral awareness to make you more dangerous, which it does, by the way. So when those old people are doing that, and looks really beautiful, some of them are getting pretty dangerous. Okay. So this is the machinery of ritual. This is why it's so powerful. And again, not routine, because we all have routines. What significant rituals do you have in your life? What significant rituals do you have in your life? What I'm trying to show you is very powerful psychotechnologies, very powerful machineries for mythos have been lost to you. The powerful functionality, the powerful abilities to transform consciousness and cognition have been lost. Yes?
So, like, when you say what kind of significant symbol or ritual you have, are you talking about like personal things? Like, for example, like let's say you have a tattoo, it's like a significant symbol for yourself.
Right.
Like for something to share.
Well, of course it's supposed to be shared. That's why you have it on your skin.
Well, yeah. Or like rituals as in, like, you know, right before you go to bed, like you have your little like stretching routine or
That's a routine,
all right.
as you said. Now, tattoos can be symbols. This is a symbol for me. Right? It's a symbol of the numinous, tiger, tiger burning bright in the forest of the night. It's a symbol of what I'm trying to achieve in Tai Chi, moving like a tiger. It's a symbol for those things. Right? So tattoos can be symbols, but very often they're just advertisements. Right? But they can be. But it speaks something that I feel compelled to get so many tattoos because of the hunger for symbols that I think our culture is experiencing.
By symbols, do you mean triggering some ideas via images?
Pardon me?
By symbols, do you mean triggering some ideas via images?
Well, not just ideas. I mean, it depends what you mean by ideas. I'm talking about all these different kinds of knowing and all of these different processes in you. Not only
Are there some forms of meditation that are more like on the mindfulness side of the spectrum or on the hypnosis side of the spectrum?
That's a good question. I think it's a really good question for which I do not have a really good answer, but precisely because I have not yet done I mean, I just got this published this year. So, I think, I mean, obviously, like I said, the guided meditations are like this synergy of these two, which can be problematic for certain reasons. It can get people too focused on the person who's delivering the guided meditation as opposed to the process. There's dangers to it. I don't know. Even ones that you think might be pure mindful, like Zen, have these huge hypnotic and ritualistic elements to them. I don't have a good answer, but it's a really good question. So my lack of answer does not bespeak that your question is not good.
So what's the difference between ritual and routine?
I don't think routines have these features to them.
Okay, so
And I don't think they're designed to share connections. They're just procedures for reaching goals in an effective and habituated manner.
so the definition of mindfulness is directing attention towards your own mental state.
Yeah, your own attention.
So any activity that I do, any routine that I do in which I'm aware of my own mental state, such as sitting down and listening to you right now, is an act of mindfulness.
It can be an act of mindfulness, and there might be a little element of hypnosis to it because
I'm allowing you to-
right. And so this can be, and we used to acknowledge that it is a ritual form of behavior because in a sense we're trying to share connections very deeply here.
So this class is a ritual.
I would think so.
And so the distinction between ritual
I
and
mean-
routine is not so clear.
Pardon me?
So the distinction between ritual and routine is not so clear.
Well, I mean, it's a matter of degree that's going to become a difference in kind. Right? I mean, there are clearly things like brushing your teeth, which seem to be purely routine, and then there are things like this, right?
And if you're mindful of the fact that you're
When you can turn it into a ritual, but even so, I mean, you're not sharing much. What is it that you're trying to share? Like, what's
When I
the
say
connection?
it's social thing.
Well, even at least with yourself, like when you're trying to share a connection to your future self, like the pure routine is sort of a self-imposed procedure for achieving a specific and explicit goal.
So ritual is social aspects, and it involves mindfulness.
And these aspects, and it's designed right to, as I say, share some fundamental connection, bring out some kind of significance for you, which is again why many routines don't count as rituals. So If this lecture is somewhat successful, it might bring up some significance for you. I don't know. But if it doesn't, then it might not make it into being a, sort of a full-blown ritual. Is that?
So there has to be meaning behind it.
Well, meaning in this sense of meaning that we're talking about, yeah. It has to be functioning within religio. Yes. Thomas.
So when we ask the question, what rituals do we have in our lives?
Yeah.
So, I guess Katie is, getting at us that we have a whole bunch of things that have these capacities to generate ritual, but are disconnected in many ways. Because we're not looking really, I'm going to say that one of the things we have that's not really always akin to hypnosis, but we do have in our society a lot of things that get us into communal sort of flow state activity, but it's sort of an isolated practice, right? So if you think about it, a bunch of jazz musicians just playing performances.
I've been to some jazz performances, and they become very much like rituals, and people do all this behavior. There's a charity, there's marches, and I thought I was going to church when I went to a jazz performance, and I was like, wow.
And it's part of the audience,
Yeah, it's so participatory, yeah. So we do, but the problem, as you said, which is what I think those are rituals, it's not clear how significant they are to people in the sense of how much it is doing all of this work for them. It could be, I'm not saying, you've heard my argument, I don't think anything is intrinsically relevant, right? It could function that way, and I think for maybe some of the people, especially some jazz musicians, I think it does. I think jazz is if you'll allow me, it's a religion for them.
It's a legit something bigger.
And I do think all of us do this. Now, I thought somebody would put up their hand when I kept asking these questions. Significant symbol or significant rituals you have. Many of you, because the research points this, try to find this in your romantic relationships. You try to make the person, a symbol for you, a significant symbol, and you enter into very ritualized behavior with this other person. And again, that's part of the romantic heritage. Romanticism. Read Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. It's this whole poem about the meaning crisis, written in the 1840s, about the sea of faith withdrawing and the meaning crisis, and then he ends the poem with this sort of desperate, well, my love, let's you and I at least be true to each other. And that's, go and read it. Read Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold. And that's, you see it happening. Oh my God, the meaning crisis. Well, at least we have, but he's wise enough to realize that it's going to be insufficient because he actually ends the poem after mentioning romantic love. He goes back and ends the poem in despair because he knows it's not going to be adequate enough. You understand that I am not criticizing romantic relationships. I think they are very important to a good life. And we can work out a lot of this machinery in our romantic relationships. I just question the philosophical romanticism that tries to make the romantic relationships the sole bearer of the project of restoring religio in the face of the meaning crisis. I think that is actually way too much pressure and demand and expectation we put on our romantic relationships, which is actually causative of their failing. That's what I'm arguing. I'm actually arguing against romanticism precisely because I value romantic relationships. The problem is the romantics won so well that when we refer to the relationships as romantic relationships, they convinced us that they were right. And I'm arguing that they were wrong. Okay. So we got what's going on with symbols, The power of stories, power of rituals and ceremonies, all those ways we're showing, where the action is just showing, we're not doing, we're showing. Right? That's what rituals are. And then, of course, we talked about this before, souvenirs. The fact that what we do is, in order to deal with the gappiness in our memory, the insubstantiality of our past, the fact that it is constantly being reconstructed and rewriting, we try to stabilize it so that we can get hindsight from our past. And the way we try to stabilize it is we try to create salience tags, salience markers by which we can retrace out our memory pathway. Now, of course, in one sense, we fail because those souvenirs are also subject to reconstructive memory, reinterpretation. They do not preserve an objective account of what happened. That's why you can have this weird phenomenon. Get out an old picture of somebody you loved 2 or 3 relationships ago, and you look at them and you go, what was it? Right? Now, the opposite can happen. You can pick up a picture from 2 relationships ago and you go, oh, right, I remember. And it has to do with who you are now in your current context, right? So, they don't work in the sense of giving us an objective, stabilized, right, past. But what they do is they give us a connectedness. They allow us to supplement and enhance our connection to our own past. And so, from very early on, right, human beings start to gather souvenirs, both historically and also developmentally. Children start to gather things. So, when he was young, right, like around 3 or 4, Spencer liked to gather, like he would keep sort of what he called shiny metal. He would find little pieces of metal and he would gather them together and he would sort of use them to remember like experiences he'd had, and he was using them to try and re-trigger sort of moments of wonder that he had had. So it was really kind of touching thing to see. It's like, you know, obviously when he'd seen this piece of metal, because it was often brass and it would be shiny, it sort of created a moment of wonder, and then he kept it because he was trying to store and keep those moments of wonder. It was almost like he was trying to keep a record of his own cognitive growth, which was really kind of, but eventually, of course, he lost interest in it. But from very early on, we're doing this souveniring process. We are trying very, very hard, right, to create opportunities for hindsight. We're trying to supplement our meager memories with objects that can help us reconstruct, and I'm using that word very deliberately, our past. Because hindsight is important to the other sites. The point about your memory is not to give you an accurate record of the past, it is to help you to intelligently prepare for the future, anticipate the future. And so we often go back and we want to stay connected to our past. Part of it is because we're trying to thwart our impermanence. We're trying to thwart the fact that we are perpetually mortal, always disappearing. Right? But also, and in connection with that, what we are trying to do is we're trying to glean from the past, right, how to go forward into the future. Both by trying to avoid our mistakes and also, right, perhaps, you know, reproduce our successes. Okay, so this is what I'm going to mean when I say the machinery of mythos. I mean all of this functionality that's at work. And especially insofar as mythos can pick up on, right, the significance landscape and afford the 3 loves and, right, afford the perspectival knowing that is so central to wisdom, etc. That's what I mean by the machinery of mythos. And if I have the machinery of mythos, I can now start to talk about the generation of the sacredness landscape. So, I hope at least I'm convincing you of the elegance of the construct, because we're explaining more, it's multi-acted, it's allowing us to explain more and more and more in a complexifying manner of what we mean by meaning, the meaning that was lost in the meaning crisis. But I want you to go further. So, we now have a fuller explication of mythos. And part of what I think sacredness is sacredness is a higher order version of this core feature, that relevance can be recursive on itself. It can take itself as what it is interested in order to engender self-transformation and self-transcendence. What I think sacredness is when mythos is about religio itself. When what we're trying to do are use stories and symbols and shows and souvenirs for religio itself, for this whole process. So a sacred symbol is ultimately about trying to enhance religio. Now, sacred symbols are often also religious in the sense that they will mix credo with religio in the way that we talked about last class. But I'm primarily concentrating on the sacredness aspect, the experiential aspect of sacredness, perhaps is a better way of putting it. So, when you create stories that are primarily about this machinery, when you create symbols that are primarily about this machinery, when you create rituals that are primarily about this machinery, then you are starting to share connections in a way that recursively feeds back on all of this machinery and alters all of your loves, your knowing, and your landscapes. It does this. It is a broad-scale, comprehensive recursion. It is a way in which you find the generation of significance itself significant, in which you are ultimately interested in the process rather than the product. Another way of putting it is that I think that sacredness is an attempt to use the recursive properties of relevance realization to enhance the whole process of religio, to enhance that fundamental framing, that connectedness, to bind us more powerfully to ourselves, to each other, and to our world. That's what I think the sacredness landscape is. Now, of course, there's going to be lots of variation on claims, on the credo made about the sacred symbols and the sacred souvenirs and the sacred stories. Some of those claims are going to be supernaturalistic claims. Some of those claims are going to be political claims. Right? I'm not interested in the credo aspects right now, because even the credo, I'm only interested in its functional aspect. And that's what I'm trying to talk about here. Because I'm not trying to talk about this or that particular claim. I'm trying to talk about the machinery itself, because that's what cognitive science can do for us. I think any claim, as I said last time, that claims to be the final solution to relevance should be criticized for that very claim, because of that claim, I think, goes against the very fundamental nature of relevance realization as an evolving and involving process. Now, there's going to be more to sacredness than that. But when the mythos is ultimately about the religio, that's when we're starting to get sacredness. When we find the very process by which significance and love and the knowings and all of this is created, when we find that itself significant. When we are trying to hold it in mind with symbols, when we are trying to set out courses of action for enhancing it with stories. This is sacredness. This is what makes stories sacred. This is what makes symbols sacred. Now, very often, right, we interpenetrate these things. We have sacred stories that involve sacred symbols that are usually connected with sacred shows, ceremonies, and rituals that usually figure around sacred souvenirs. We almost always are mixing these all together. But there's something more to this. Is the recursive aspect of it, the attempt to enhance and enrich religio itself. By again making use of this fundamental scale invariant property of relevance realization to be a recursive, self-transcending, self-transformative process. Sacredness is not to have this particular insight in your cognition of your consciousness. It's the attempt to have an insight of your consciousness, of your cognition, to have the whole machinery fundamentally restructured. But to get at more of the functionality, because this is only the beginning, we should talk about what happens when it's lost. When it's lost. Because then we can get a little bit more about why the enhancement, why the need to enrich. Is it just sort of an aesthetic thing to try and enhance and enrich? Or is that functionality of enhancement and enrichment directed towards some specific and ongoing issues and goals? And I think it is. The way to talk about this is to talk about two instances where this kind of machinery is significantly lost. So one, this is really weird. I was on the train and I was reading literature. I was reading some book. I was reading a book about this, and the guy across from me started talking to me about it, and it turned out to be this person that I'm going to teach you about, Brian Walsh. I was like, oh, that's really cool. So we talked about it. So Brian Walsh is doing work on a community that's in Canada, and I'm trying to remember. It's near Kenora. I'm trying to remember the name of the community. Let me just go over the history. I can't because I'm sick. My memory isn't working as well as it should. What happened is the following thing. The government relocated the community, and it looks like explicitly to try and improve their health. Yes? Yeah, the Anishinaabe, thank you. Now, there were some mistakes there, and there are definitely issues about pollutants in the water, but that's not the primary aspect that Walsh is talking about. Because what happened is they moved the people in order to give them better housing, better sort of roads, communication system, better infrastructure, better access to healthcare, etc. So the whole point was to modernize their housing. And so people moved, and then very shortly thereafter, things started to go very, very badly for the community. And here's how one of the elders put it, a 71-year-old elder. I'm going to read it. This is a direct quote. He said, "We don't live like the white man. That's not our way." The word way, by the way, captures a lot of, it's a word that we use to try and capture all of these aspects of knowing. Okay? That's not our way. The white man lives close together, but we don't. We like to live far apart in families. Notice that's a contrast that we don't get. We like to live far apart in families. It sounds like an oxymoron to us because we understand family as this nuclear thing. Right? On the old reserve, you knew your place. Everybody respected your place. It wasn't private property. It was a sense of place. Notice how he keeps hammering on this, right? Your place, your force around you. As soon as they started to bunch us up, the problems started. The drinking, the violence. This has to do a lot with being bunched up. Now what Walsh did was he went in and he took a look at it, and he looked at, right, the difference between a house and a home. A house and a home. And the point he was investigating was that what we do with our houses is that they are basically mythos machines. They are machines where we collect souvenirs, symbols, tell stories, do our rituals, do our ceremonies, do our demonstrations, do our performances, do our dramatization, do all of our shows, right? And so home has the function of, right, basically affording mythos making. And a lot of the mythos making, right, gives you that fundamental religio. What term does he keep trying to use to give that sense of connectedness? He keeps saying place, because place is space you belong to. That's the difference between a place and a space. It is one that you have a connection to, that you have some religio for, that your knowing comes to bear, that you are interconnected with in some way. And that's why he even shifts from place to sense of place, and then he tries another way of getting it, your force around you. Obviously he's using a metaphor, or at least I believe he's using a metaphor. I don't believe in supernatural forces or anything like that. And I don't think it's completely appropriate to attribute that to First Nations communities anyway, because supernatural is, as you know, a notion from Thomas Aquinas. And I doubt that those cultures originally were reading Thomas Aquinas. Okay? So, what he's trying to get at, a force, it's almost like the term is used in Star Trek, that sense of deep connectedness, of religio, that causes other people to respect you, that makes persons, that puts you into families. He's struggling to talk about, right, the fact that a home, right, is basically how a house has been used as a mythos machine. Which is why, by the way, one of the most standard metaphors for meaninglessness is a sense of homelessness, which again is why one of the pervasive symbols, one of the unique properties of zombies is again that they are homeless, unlike almost all the other monsters. Even, it's hard to think of a monster that doesn't have a home, that isn't in some sense defined by its home. Vampires by their coffins, werewolves by their lairs, ghosts by the house they haunt, etc. But zombies drift, they're homeless. Think about where you probably engage in the most symbolic aspects of your life, where you tell most of your stories. This is also what people lose when they go to other cultures and experience what is called culture shock. You go to the other culture, and although you may have adequate housing there, you do not feel at home there. You do not feel at home because the mythos machinery is not working for you, and your religio is fundamentally threatened. And as any good anthropologist will tell you, when you do full participant observation, when you go and actually allow yourself to be enculturated in another culture, it is a very demanding thing. It comes close to breaking a lot of people. It is one of the most arduous things a human being can go through. Because losing that at-homedness is deeply distressing. Because anything that undermines this is, right, undermining the fundamental machinery by which you make sense of the world, yourself, other people, and get a sense of connectedness to yourself, the world, and other people. So, what happens is like the meaning crisis in microcosm. You get a huge spike in suicides, substance abuse, right? Physical abuse, mental health crisis, explosion in violence. The community just falls apart. And so Walsh goes in and he tries to understand what was going on. Why does home do this? And what he does is he taps into a notion which we've talked about before, but we're going to talk about it more general. He talks about the connection between home and worldview attunement. And he makes use of a term that has been created by Porteous and Smith for talking about the destruction of home. There's two versions of it. One is the destruction of your home by destroying your house. The other is the destruction of your home while leaving you with your house by destroying the mythos machinery associated with turning your house into a home. I'm more interested in the second one because that's what's happening in the Kenora community. They actually had better housing, but they lost their home. The term for this is domicile, the killing of home. And it's becoming a pervasive event in our culture. And as I said, I think it is representative of a particular way in which the meaning crisis is taking root in people's lives. Many people, when you talk to them about meaning crisis issues, like in therapy, they will talk about not having a sense of home or a sense of place or a place where they belong. Now, what is worldview attunement? Well, this is a notion that came from Clifford Geertz. We talked about a version of this. Do you remember the Aristotelian worldview? And you remember how it had two things. It had a model of viewing and a model of the world, and how those two, right, fit together. Right? And what's going on in worldview attunement is actually that. You're getting one of those patterns that I talked about. This bidirectional model, right, that tells you, right, turns you into an agent. It tells you how to behave. It's a model for behavior, but it's also a model of the world, right? Which tells you the important structures and principles you're supposed to know. That's, of course, what the Aristotelian worldview did for us, right? The two reinforce each other. It shapes you to a place, and if I can put it that way, turns that space into a place for you. Turns you into an agent, and the world into an arena for your actions. It's worldview attunement. Why is this important? Because, as we talked about, that's this fundamental machinery. That's the connectedness between your brain and the environment that you need in order to be able to intelligently interact with your world, in order to get your relevance realization machinery running. This lecture is going to be a race between the content and my throat. See which lasts the longer. Okay, so when this machinery is put out of whack, when you lose worldview attunement, then what happens, according to Geertz, is you start to experience something like horror. You start to experience that sense of being disconnected from yourself, from other people, and from reality. You start to experience alienation. You start to experience, because you're disconnected from other people and the environment. You start to experience futility because it's not clear to you how you should act. You start to experience anxiety because things are not fundamentally making sense to you. You are culture shocked. But the thing about domicile is you're shocked within your culture. So you can't return home to your culture to alleviate your culture shock. There is no home to go to because the culture shock is from within your culture. You're losing worldview attunement. Now, what's interesting, and I think Walsh is making implicit connection to that, is Geertz thought that this was the fundamental function of religion. What Geertz argued is that religion is a meta-meaning system. So we have lots of individual meaning systems. We have the legal meaning system, we have a moral meaning system, we have all kinds, we have sports meaning, we have all these meaning systems, right? What religion is religion is a meta-meaning system. Religion's job is to maintain worldview attunement so all the other meaning systems will continue to work. Because if this fundamental connectedness is broken, then all the other meaning systems will eventually degrade and decompose because they are dependent on this fundamental connection. So religion is it's a really interesting proposal. It's not that religion itself is meaningful, it's that religion functions to maintain worldview attunement so that all of our other meaning systems continue to work. So worldview attunement is a meta-meaning process. So part of what I'm going to argue is that sacredness, right, is when we have a mythos about religio, and one of the things it does is it acts in a meta-meaning fashion to preserve worldview attunement. Now, I think Geertz is wrong about religion because he's incomplete. Because this is a very conservative view. The point about religion is to console you and protect you from horror. And there's a sense in which that's right. But there's a sense in which exactly the opposite happens in religion. So opposed to this, right, is the work of Rudolf Otto and others. So we wrote a classic book that has a very poor English translation. The English translation is The Idea of the Holy. And because for many of us, because we've come from this long Judeo-Christian heritage, the word holy for us is primarily a moral category. Right? A better translation, a more literal translation, would be the experience of the numinous. The experience of the numinous. And part of what Otto was going on about is that many religions function by trying to get people to encounter the numinous. To encounter the numinous. Part of what sacredness isn't going to just be this attunement, I'm going to argue. It's also going to be this encounter with the numinous. Now, what is the numinous? So Otto talks about it having, right, this property. It's a mystery. We'll talk about what that means. It's both fascinating and terrifying or horrifying. Okay, so first of all, right, we have to talk about what a mystery is because it doesn't mean what you think it means, or at least the way we're commonly using it. The best connection for picking up what the word mystery originally means is mystical. The mystical is not about magic or fairies. It's about, right, it's about what's mysterious and in a technical sense. So the Greek word for mystery means to close your eyes and close your mouth. It basically means to shut up and to give up sort of what you're seeing. And you say, well, what? That sounds ridiculous. Well, not totally, because remember, at the core of relevance realization is intelligently ignoring what you shouldn't pay attention to. But in order to get at what a mystery means, I'm using machinery that lines up with this, because a really good essay was written on this by the philosopher Gabriel Marcel. He's a Christian existentialist philosopher. The essay is entitled Ontological Mystery. And he says a mystery is fundamentally different from a problem. In fact, most mystery novels are not mystery novels at all. They are problem novels. There's a problem that is solved. This is what a mystery is. A mystery is when you try to frame some phenomena to get an understanding of it, to make it intelligible, to size it up, as we've said. And then you realize, perhaps in a kind of insight, that that framing is inadequate. You need a more encompassing frame. And then you move to it, and then you realize that framing is still inadequate. And you do this, and then suddenly you realize this isn't going to stop. This isn't going to stabilize. Kant talks about this in the Third Critique. Fisher talks about it in his book on Wonder. This phenomena in which we find ourselves in a perpetual trajectory of transframing. Transframing isn't when you reframe. Transframing is when you try to move to a more encompassing frame, and it doesn't stabilize. You have this trajectory of transframing that is going on. We'll talk about a little bit more about transframing when we talk about sensibility transcendence. So what you get is this sense of expansion rather than a stabilized understanding. And of course, we have a lot of metaphors for this, right? You know, blowing your mind and expanding your consciousness and stuff like that. Right? So, when I was married, I would go into my stepson's room, and they had whiteboards on there. And because I'm the kind of guy I am, I would write on their whiteboard, does time take time to happen? And then I would leave. Because the point is, when you try to think about time, right, whatever frame you use actually is presupposing time, and you try to do this, and very quickly you go. And you get what Augustine says, I know what time is until you ask me. And time becomes this mystery. Doesn't mean you can't talk about it in physics and blah, blah, blah. But when you really try to know, I really want to, what's time? You can't get it. Here's another one. Your own death. Now you can have facts about you. You know you're going to die. You probably don't believe it right now because you're all under 30. And so you really do labor under a lot of illusions about both your control over events and how long you're going to live. And we all do it, so you're not guilty of any sin. Which is part of, I think, the way humans evolved to develop, because if we were really confronted early on in our life with mortality, we would fall into despair and not successfully reproduce. So that's what it is. Anyways, back to it, okay? Your own death is a phenomenological mystery. It's a perspectival mystery to you. If I ask you, what's it like to be dead, you can't tell me. I can't tell you either. Whenever you try and imagine what it's like looking at darkness. No, it's not. Because you're alive to look at the darkness. Well, it's like being all alone. No, it's not. Because you're alive and aware that you're all alone. And you can get into these weird sort of paradoxes. One of my favorite versions of this is a joke in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, played by Tom Stoppard. And they can never figure out which one is Rosencrantz and which one is Guildenstern. It's a running joke throughout the play. And what's happening, the play's very interesting because it's about the meaning crisis. Because they're representing the meaning crisis, interacting with Hamlet. And Shakespeare's Hamlet, is going on in the background. And then they will speak the lines they do from the play. It's a brilliant play. But anyway, they're talking about death. And the one character, again, I don't know which, he says, I think death is like, a journey. I think death is like being on a boat. And the other guy goes, no, it's not. Death is like not being at all. And you cannot be on a boat. And the other character says, I have frequently not been on boats. Right? Not getting the point, right? It's not that you're not one place as opposed to somewhere else. It's that you're not at all. And you can't get a perspectival grasp on them. Part of the problem with immortality is we have propositional knowledge of our death that does not translate into any perspectival experience. So death is a mystery to us. Now, when we try to frame it, we get that, and we get a sense. The other thing that's a mystery to you is actually your own source of agency. What do I mean by that? This is a point made famous by William James. And Nishida and other Buddhist philosophers picked up on this. When I try to become aware of who I am, what I do is I step back and look at certain properties of myself. Oh, there's me. What's not there is the I that's looking at that. There's only the observed aspects, not the observer. So I step back and try to look at that part that was looking. Ah, there I am. But unfortunately, you know what I haven't caught? Who's looking? Oh, no. Oh, wait. And then you get, and this is what Buddhism means by, you're not a thing. No thing. Because you can't bring that mystery into your cognitive content. There is a framing, a fundamental framing that you can never actually bring into the frame. You can't do it. There's an aspect of yourself that transcends any frame you can create because there's the capacity to create whatever ultimate frame content you think you've arrived at. There's a no-thingness. There's an emptiness. Yes?
Sorry, so do you mean that there's something that's sort of like just fundamentally infinitely regressive?
Not just infinitely regressive. You experience it as kind of an infinite regress. But what I'm saying is there's an aspect that you can't bring into the framing. So your own, James called it the difference between your I and your me. And if you'll allow me a pun, just like the one thing your eye can't see is your eye, and I can see it in the mirror. No, you can't. You can see an image of it in the mirror. You can't actually see the seeing of your eye because you have to use your eye to see. In the same way, you can't see your eye. You can only ever see the various me's. But they are what has been framed. They are never your fundamental framing. These are mysteries. Death, yourself, time. And they're all interrelated because, of course, death is a relationship between yourself and time. When we encounter these, we find them fascinating because of this tremendous cognitive flow they engender. They draw us in. We get sucked into them. As our mind, right? It's almost like you start running down a hill, and once you start running at a certain speed, you can't stop because the momentum carries you on. You're fascinated. You're drawn in. But you're also horrified because you lose a grip on things. You lose that stable framing and grip on things. Who are you really if you can never, if at the core of what you are is a mystery? Who are you really? And what is your mortality to you? And you're in time, but you can't actually grasp this. And if I play with these ideas enough, you'll start to feel kind of creepy. You'll start to feel like, stop talking this way. And if I do it later at night with some appropriate lighting and music, I could get a good horror movie going. And it wouldn't involve any vampires, any demons, anything, just a guy talking. And it'd be terrifying. Okay. The numinous is that. Think about when people, and this is one of these things that angers me. It shouldn't, because I understand why people, when people slow down on a highway to look at an accident. Because what they're doing is increasing the chances that there are going to be more accidents. And they're doing it because death is numinous. It's mysterious, it's fascinating, it's horrifying. They want to look, they don't want to look, and they're hoping, and it's like, well, if I could just, then I'll get it. Then I'll get the narrative. I'll get death. I'll get it. And of course they don't. What you see is corpse, made of wreckage, human beings trying their best to wipe it up, clean up the mess, deal with the irretrievable loss and damage. What Otto argued is that this is the original feature of God. God isn't originally just or righteous or good. God is originally numinous. It's had this experience that's fundamentally mysterious, ominous, fascinating, and horrifying. That's why the word that is most often, what's the word that is most often used to describe God in the Bible, for example, and in a lot of the Abrahamic literature, in fact? Glory. What does glory mean? What is it for something to be glorious? Now we've made it sort of nice, but originally monarchs were glorious because they were like that. They were mysterious, fascinating, and terrifying. That's what glory is. It's you're a luminous presence. You're shining. You are overwhelming. That's why you cover your eyes. That's why you don't want to see the gods. It's in the Greek myths. There's this Greek myths, and I want to see. People will say to Zeus, I want to see you in all of your glory. Same word, same idea. And Zeus will say, no, you don't. Yes, I do. No, you don't. Yes, I do. Okay. That's how it goes. There's about 17 myths like that. Right? There's a really strange one in the Bible where Moses says, you know, I've done a lot for you. We got a pretty good relationship, right? You know, 10 Commandments, all that sort of stuff. God says, yeah, okay, great. That's good. And he says, I want to see you. I want to see you in all of your glory. God says, this isn't a good idea. Moses says, please, please, please. So God says, well, this is what I'll do. This is a strange story. Again, there's no moral lesson in it. God says, I'm going to put you in a rock. I'm going to put my hand over you. I'm going to whip by, and at the last minute, I'll take off my hand, and you can see my bum. Basically, that's the Hebrew, right? So Moses gets a glimpse of God's rear end, and that's almost too much for him. It's a really weird story, and when you read that, you read this, what's this about? We've been taught for all this long heritage. There's deep moral lessons. Like, what's the moral lesson? Right? Well, there isn't one. It's a story that's trying to just get at the numinous nature of God. That God represents, right, something that is so mysterious and fascinating and so horrifying that if you come into its full presence, you will be ripped apart. So, what you're supposed to do, religions are supposed to, and the whole story is, right, this discussion about human beings need to encounter the numinous, but they can't encounter too much. That's why Moses only gets to see sort of a glimpse of God's butt. Right? It's a myth to try and tell us we desire intimacy with the numinous, but of we have to be careful. Because what the numinous ultimately is I think, the affordance of of a tremendous transformation, a tremendous kind of insight. It is this amazing, energetic synergy of a cascade of breaking frame, making frame, breaking frame, making frame, breaking frame, making frame. It is like super training for your insight machinery. So that makes it fascinating and really, really good. But if you push that too far, you'll actually fracture the machinery, and that will bring insanity, and that's bad. That's what that story is about. So please be it that the only thing you don't remember from New 333 was the story of Moses seeing God's blood. Okay? That's the point of the story. This bizarre story actually has a point. And a lot of the Bible is actually about trying to figure out how do we get the relationship we need with the numinous. Part of the axial of evolution, as we talked about, was the idea of trying to that get at God through a moral sort of structure and contract that tamed and held in place the numinous. This survives for a very long time. How many of you have heard of C.S. Lewis or the Narnia Chronicles? Okay. Now Lewis was, he's a very good, the Inklings they were all about this, like Tolkien and Williams and Garfield and Lewis. And there's an important scene where Lewis is trying to get this. So many of you know at least one of the stories, and you know that Aslan is supposed to be Jesus, right? I hope that's not a shocker for you or anything like that. And there's two really important stories about this. One time, a little girl wrote Lewis and said, I have to confess something, I feel really guilty about it. And she said, I like Aslan better than Jesus. And Lewis, because he got this, said, that's fine, go ahead. Lewis was a devout Christian, an apologist Christian, but he understood that if she was relating to Aslan in the right way, that's it, that's fine. The second thing from Lewis is about Aslan, and this is inside the story. Some of the kids are talking about Aslan, and one says, oh, Aslan, right? Is he a tame lion? And they go, and the people around go, oh no, he's not tame. He's very dangerous, but he's good. They're trying to get that behind the moral goodness, there's still the numinous. That's why he was represented by a lion. That's why Blake used a tiger to represent the numinous. Tiger, tiger, bird of flight, in the forest of the night. What immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? He's trying to say that you can encounter a tiger and encounter the numinous. And that's more primordial than the Christian notion of God. That's why I have to do it. One of the reasons. Now look, this is also a meta-meaning thing. It's not giving you any stable meaning. It's playing with the very meaning-making machinery itself. So I think sacredness is also about this. It's mythos about religio that helps us create worldview attunement, but also helps us to encounter the numinous. And I think these are, again, a higher order version of the very relevance realization machinery. This is assimilation. Worldview attunement is about stabilizing, integrating, fitting things together. This is about opening up your options, making new things possible. This is about accommodating the mind to a reality that transcends it. This is about assimilating the world to the mind so it can function within it. These are the two parts, right? This goes like integration and, right, particularization. This is complexification. This is the Piagetian version of relevance realization. The sacred is doing this higher order, comprehensive, recursive relevance realization on the whole machinery of relevance realization. Because you're doing this recursion in order to do these two functions. Protect us from horror, give us worldview attunement so we can act effectively and maintain all of our existing meaning structures. We can assimilate. But it is also exposing us to the numinous so that we have to accommodate, so that we have to go through, right, an adjustment to a world that is always beyond and transcends our framing of it. Because the world itself is combinatorially explosive. That's why it's always going to be a potential source of the numinous for us. Because combinatorial explosion is the way in which the complexity of the world transcends your framing of it in a way that would undermine your agency and render you incapable of solving any problems. But of course, you don't want to completely isolate yourself from that field of combinatorial explosion because it is also the field that affords your growth your reframing, your insight, etc., etc. This is, I think, the machinery that generates the sacredness landscape. When we have a mythos about religio itself that serves to enhance and enrich religio so that it can do the opponent processing of engendering worldview attunement and encountering the numinous, so that, right, our fundamental framing, our fundamental fittedness to the world is ongoing. So the degree to which we lose not only symbols and, right, significant symbols, the degree to which we lose sacredness is also the degree to which we lose all of this. So, not only are zombies homeless, you know what they're not? They're not numinous. There's nothing about them that's ultimately mysterious. They're just us degraded. So, one of the things you can do, and it's not necessary, one of the things you can do is you can make some mistakes about this. You can have a particular credo that makes a claim that becomes so repeated, so paradigmatic, that we start forgetting to question it. The West, especially post-Aquinas, has done this. Because of the way Aquinas fractured, right, did the thing with the two worlds, played with the axial age machinery. So sacred means supernatural. That's become almost so paradigmatic. It's become almost the lens that we look through, that we forget that we can step back and actually question that. And I've given you both the historical and the cognitive scientific resources for questioning that proposal. Why is it that the sacred has to be supernatural? There's nothing in the history, right, that says that. We have a particular turn of events around Aquinas why that proposition was advanced. But those are historical reasons. They're not formal. They're not necessary. They were an indispensable part of our history, but they're not metaphysically necessary. And that's the mistake, to confuse what was indispensable in our history with what is metaphysically necessary to reality. That had to happen in our history. That doesn't mean that's the way things are. That's a confusion. That's to confuse historical indispensability with metaphysical necessity. There's no necessity that the sacred has to refer to the supernatural. A lot of the American debate around atheism is both sides assume that proposition. And Richard Dawkins says, it doesn't exist because there's no supernatural. And the fundamentalists say, it does exist because there is the supernatural. And the debate is useless. Because, I'd like to debate both sides at the same time. But probably not, actually. That would probably be really hard. But, because what I am arguing against, and I'm giving you historical arguments, and now, right, structural arguments, for rejecting that claim. That's what Nietzsche was trying to get at with the death of God. People think it's a statement about, oh, there is nothing supernatural. That's not what Nietzsche's doing. When he walks into the marketplace, when the madman walks into the marketplace to pronounce, in Nietzsche's writing, the death of God, who's he talking to? He's talking to the atheists, not to the believers. The madman talks to the atheists, and he says, you don't get it. You don't get it. How did we kill God? How can we live with this? We have to become something other than we are to be worthy of this deed. We have to somehow replace this functionality. We have to come up with a new kind of sacredness. And Nietzsche writes a lot about sacredness because he understood that the fundamental project was, how can we re-get the sacred once we've given up the identity of the sacred with the supernatural? I agree with Nietzsche. I think that God is dead. I think the supernatural does not exist. I think that is what the history of science increasingly shows. We are going back, that's what I meant. We are being re-embedded into the natural world. What I'm trying to prepare you for with all this argument is that it doesn't mean that we have to have given up all of this machinery. So perhaps there are religions, or at least religios, in which the sacred is not supernatural. And of course there are. We've had trouble recognizing that because whenever we look at them through Christian eyes, and we immediately assert that their sacred is supernatural on their behalf. But if you go in and actually look at it from the inside, it's not supernatural. I think the Tao in Taoism is not supernatural. I think Shunyata in Buddhism is not supernatural. There's lots of sacred that is not supernatural. But what we can ask is, are there other instances of things like this that have happened on a more comprehensive scale? What I meant by this is I meant something like domicide. Notice, by the way, how the Nazis are working so hard to generate this machinery. Nazism is trying to give you, like blood and soil, you have this ultimate fatherland, homeland. It's trying to give you this, but it's also trying to create the numinous. Right? The numinous is this, this nebulous gravitas that is surrounding Hitler. And he's constantly shocking and breaking the frame, and he's mysterious, and what's he going to do next? We don't know. That's part of why Nazism is not a coherent political ideology, because Hitler has to constantly be numinous. We're hungry for this stuff because it provides fundamental functionality for our fundamental framing of reality, ourselves, other people, and the world. Now, this has all been sort of dark, but I want to point to, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, would you say that you're using mythos or I guess symbols and rituals to enforce a belief system, isn't that kind of unintelligent? Because you're getting stuck in a frame where every aspect, every symbol supports everything else. It's self-supporting, of course, but you're stuck in this internal reference frame instead of being as objective as possible.
Which one? Who are you talking about?
Any religion which uses mythos, which is all of them.
Well, I mean, that would be to say that this is all a religion is doing, which I've tried to argue it's not, right? So you'll constantly get, right, an aspect of religion that's trying to do the opposite, right? Give you encounters with the numinous, very spiritual exercise to induce mystical experiences in you, shake you to the core, break you out of your framing, open you up to the mystery of God, things like that.
And this is useful for attaining knowledge?
It's useful for, do you mean for somebody from the inside or from us reflecting on it?
For getting at true knowledge.
I don't think any of this is about knowledge. I think this is about wisdom.
Or getting at true wisdom.
Yes. I think this is what it is. I think this is not primarily about trying to get a stabilized set of beliefs. That's to confuse credo, I think, with religio, and to think there is some final representation about relevance, which I don't think there is. I think this is about, right, the process of wisdom, trying to train, enhance, and enrich the religio machinery so it can function as optimally as humanly possible. I would say that that's ultimately what enlightenment is. Because remember, the Buddha was very clear. He claimed he was not a god. He was not a heavenly messenger. He was not a prophet. But he also said he wasn't a normal man. He was awake. This is about the potential for waking up. Now, it is also, and that's why I constantly refer to it, the Nazis, it is also machinery that can be used for exactly the opposite purposes, to really infetter and enslave human minds. But that's precisely how you sort of get at how transformative and how powerful this machinery is. Part of the problem we're facing is the only sort of mythos systems, and I think this is what you're alluding to, that have had this kind of transformative power, right? And not only on the individual level, but on the mythos level, at the cultural community level. The only things that could bring about these kinds of radical, transformations have been religions. They seem to be the civilization building machine we have created. The problem is, for many of us, we're post-religious, as I mentioned, and we've tried these secular alternatives, Nazism, Marxism, Romanticism, and they have ended generally in disaster for us. So we need something like this machinery to deal with the overwhelming crises we're facing: environmental, economic, social justice, energy. We need this machinery of religion, but we're terrified because we seem to be caught between Scylla and Charybdis. We can't go back to the religious version, and yet we have seen and we've been terrified by the secular versions. That's part of the meaning crisis. You're welcome. Yes?
How is the Tao not supernatural?
Pardon me?
How is the Tao not supernatural?
Well, why do you think it's supernatural?
That's
Does-
what I'm trying to make the word supernatural.
Okay, so the Tao means the way. It means sort of the way behind things, right? The way behind all of the contrasts. So all of the binaries are nevertheless limit our vision, and behind them is a mystery, a darkness within darkness, as the Tao Te Ching says, right? It's a mystery that you can't grasp. If you can name it and say what it is, then of course you have lost it. That's why the Tao Te begins with, the way that can be spoken is not the way. And it is not just a proposition, it's a way. It's a procedure and a perspective. It is in fact much more a procedure and a perspective than a proposition. But why does that have to be supernatural? Why does that have to exist or point to an aspect of the world, right, that transcends physical laws, is the source of magical power, all that sort of stuff? Why does that have to be the case?
So you mean supernatural is something that basically contradicts our proposition?
The supernatural is a world that operates opposite to reason, right? So there's nothing anti-rational or contra-rational about the Tao. In fact, it's very much like what we had in Augustine. The Tao represents a love, a way in us that is at the heart of reason and takes us beyond reason. But it is in no way antithetical. It's where reason and love have a common source. You don't need to separate the worlds the way Aquinas does to deal with the Tao. The Tao is deeply natural. In fact, that's one of the central things about it, is the way nature ultimately functions.
I just wanted to put this out of my head, so I'm sorry. But I wanted to really clarify the difference between the numinous and the supernatural. Is the numinous like we're co-creating with this force that's generating insight and shaping our consciousness so that we can co-create our reality. And then the supernatural is almost this idea of this external force that where like stuff is happening at us and we almost don't have any agency.
Right. Okay. Let me try and do it more concretely now.
Okay.
If you were to start to open your mind to the combinatorially explosive amount of information here, you would experience the numinous. Do any of you think there are supernatural entities in this room? No. That's what I'm talking about. The numinous has to deal with the fact that reality is ultimately combinatorially explosive. And we can open ourselves up to that, and we can start to play with the machine, and we realize, oh my gosh. But that doesn't mean that I've proven to you that there are entities made out of weird substances that have weird energies that obey different principles. I haven't done any of that. That's what I'm talking about. Did that help?
Can they be complementary, or do you see them as opposite one another?
Which?
The supernatural and the
I think the supernatural is one interpretation of numinous. And like I said, it was indispensable in our history. It is how Aquinas, I think there was no other way for Aquinas to solve the problem of trying to bring Aristotelian science back in. But the fact that it was indispensable in our history doesn't mean that that's the way it must be, that equation. Because as our discussion is showing, other cultures haven't drawn that equation. And yet they clearly have the sacred. They clearly have this machinery, all of this machinery working. They're clearly capable of significant self-transcendence, significant wisdom, getting into fantastic states of flow. That's what Taoism is ultimately about. It is the religion of flow. And I don't think flow is anything supernatural. Flow is amazing. It's extraordinary. But the extraordinary shouldn't be interpreted as a supernatural. I think this is also, a way of modernizing the old warning of don't pursue wisdom by trying to cultivate magic. Was that satisfying?
yeah.
Satisfying-ish. I hope I'm not bullying you. I hope I'm answering your question fairly. I'm trying to be sympathetic to the fact that, and I'm not trying to be condescending either. I'm conscious of not trying to do that. I'm trying to be helpful. I hope that's coming across. That is a very ingrained thing for us. It is one of our deepest cultural hidden presuppositions. And yet, that's what I'm asking you to try and challenge. And I think that's what Nietzsche, who hasn't been, I think, very well interpreted in some camps, was getting us to try and challenge. I think Spinoza was also doing it. Spinoza was trying to give us that's what the ethics is all about. He's using tight logic, the best science of his time. He's trying to give a completely naturalistic account of the sacred, which is explicitly saying the sacred is not the supernatural, but it doesn't mean it's not sacred. And he was using an argument very similar to mine, that God is, if you were to understand reality, you would understand it as a unified thing with infinite attributes, of which we can only grasp 2 or 3 kinds. 2 actually is what he said. But if you were to, then, right? And the whole project of the ethics is to wed Cartesian science and math to trying to get at wisdom and blessedness, a sacred kind of existence, an existence filled with meaning. So, there's a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. You should all read Spinoza. It's hard. It's very hard, but it's worth it. Because and we'll talk about this later, how Spinoza responded to the meaning crisis, because he's the first significant responder to Descartes. Unfortunately for the West, he got branded as an atheist because he was Jewish, and he got swept under the rug. Would have been really different, perhaps, in the West if he hadn't been thrown under the bus by Leibniz and other people. You were going to ask?
I'm sorry, I just don't fully see why the sacred is connected to the supernatural in our culture, or in the Western culture.
So, what I mean by that is most of the mythos in our culture for representing the sacred has become the mythos of the supernatural.
Okay.
So sacred things are like angels and saints and gods and things like that, right? I'm agreeing with you at a deeper level. I don't think there's any necessary connection between those. I think that connection happened for the historical reasons we have examined, but that's all it is, just a historical contingency. It was indispensable at the time, but there's nothing intrinsically necessary about that identification.
Okay, because I don't know if this is just because this weird connection I have where when I hear sacred, I actually connect it to Sacred Heart. I don't know, it's just a connection I have, but
What's Sacred Heart mean to you?
I always thought that the idea of the sacred, within our culture, is more related to that idea of love, because it's kind of the idea of something that shouldn't be touched in that way, or shouldn't be sullied, I guess, or whatever. So I don't really get why.
Well, let's do the history of the Sacred Heart, though. The idea is your heart is sacred because Jesus lives within it, which is a supernatural claim, if taken literally, which it can be. Of course, you can understand it metaphysically. You can understand, metaphorically, not metaphysically. You can understand it as internalizing the sage, stuff that Plato tried to get us to do with Socrates.
Yeah.
And I think that's the ultimate functionality. But many people don't see it that way. They literally believe that a supernatural
Oh, okay.
force, a spirit, meaning a supernatural immaterial substance, has somehow taken up a spatial existence within them and is directing their action. Now, that option is not necessary. For example, you could do what you have done. You could interpret all of that symbolically, metaphorically, symbolically, like we've talked about here, as engendering a way of cultivating agape and realizing it, both making yourself aware of it and making it real in your life. Yes, totally. And that's what you would be doing, would be breaking that.
Oh.
But many people treat that as an almost talismanic thing. Does that answer your question? I'm good. I'm really happy about this. I'm happy about this discussion. I'm happy that people are really like, because that indicates that, right, this is what Colleen would call, it's one of our fundamental presuppositions. One of the things what part of our lens that we find it very hard to take off and look at. And the fact that we're seriously reflecting on it means I have at least partially succeeded in getting the lenses away from your eyes. So I want to start talking about another aspect from our history that we could recover, because that might also help us better appropriate Buddhism. Can I erase the board now? Does anybody need this on? Because I want to go back to another. So the problem with the Aboriginal community, it's a small local kind of thing. I mean the problem theoretically. I mean, I'm not trying to trivialize the actual crisis there. In fact, I would want to do the opposite. I would want to bring more attention to it. Instead, I want to talk about something that was comprehensive of Western civilization. And this is a comprehensive experience of domicile that was rife through the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period is the period after Aristotle and before Augustus. Some people put it a little bit later. It's after Alexander. That's what I would do because of the argument I'm going to give you. So Socrates had Plato, Plato had Aristotle, but Aristotle didn't have a great philosophical disciple. He had Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great was a different kind of great man. He wasn't great the way Socrates or Plato or Aristotle were. Alexander the Great was great for the disaster he wrought on the world. He was a great disaster. What did he do? Well, I mean, he destroys the Persian Empire, and it's not clear that that was a good thing to do. The Persian Empire had basically linked Europe and Africa and Asia together. It had created sort of the first world civilization. So it's not clear that that was a good thing. And then after conquering most of the known world, he returns to Babylon and dies of a cold. Now, he also had created this huge mythos around himself that he was a God-man, that he was divine. He was very much trying to resurrect the pre-axial idea of a human being that could be a god because of tremendous power that he wielded. So in that sense, he was very retrogressive. And when he died, what happened is, like his heir, as a young kid, is quickly killed. The four generals that had been prominent in his army divided up the conquered world into sort of four kingdoms and then fought each other for the next 300 years, weakening each other so much that Rome was eventually able to conquer them all. So that's the Hellenistic period. Now, the way to get at what's going on in the Hellenistic period is to compare people at the time just before Alexander, people in Aristotle's time, and the people at the time just after Alexander. So before Alexander, let's do the Greek world because Alexander was promulgation of the Greek world. Before Alexander, right, where you lived, you knew most of the people around you. You lived close to your seat of government. You participated in it. You participated in the central rituals of your culture. The people around you had the same religion as you, the same language as you, the same ethnic heritage as you, the same history as you. You were deeply woven into this world to other people, to the cultural system. After Alexander, there's huge migrations, there's huge movements of people, right? There's huge disruption. Now, this is your life. You are probably thousands of miles away from the seat of government. You don't know any of the people, right, associated with that. Where you're living, you're often surrounded by people who speak a different language than you, practice a different religion, belong to a different ethnic group, right, have a different history. In some ways, parallel to our current issues, which we're not handling that well, about globalization. You could go to bed in the Seleucid Empire and wake up in the Ptolemaic Empire. And it had nothing to do with your actions. What you see in this time is a huge increase in a sense of domicile. The arts and the literature of the Hellenistic period shows anxiety. It's an age of anxiety. Domicile is creating a crisis for the Hellenistic world. A major crisis, which has a lot of important parallels to ours. However, there was a couple of important responses. One was syncretism. I think that's how it's spelled. This is where there was the attempt to create new religions by fusing different religions together. So for a famous example is Serapis in the Ptolemaic Empire. It was an integration of, I believe, Zeus and, I forget, Atum. They took a Greek deity and an Egyptian deity, and they fused them together to create a new deity to try and integrate the Greek and the Egyptian cultures together in Ptolemaic Egypt. Or you get the rise of the elevation of a national religious figure into something that is transnational. So another important thing that happens at this time is Isis in Egypt becomes, right, a deity that is being worshipped outside of Egypt. Now, why Isis, by the way? And Isis becomes so important that the images, the iconography of Isis with her little baby child Horus become the basis for most of the iconography of Mary holding Jesus. Because Isis is a mother goddess, a loving mother goddess. Why that? Because when you're experiencing domicile, what you want is a being that will give you home again. And of course, the best being for giving you home again is a loving mother goddess. So there's attempts to create religions that will draw people together through syncretism. There's the attempt to create religious individuals who will satisfy, right, that longing for home. There's the emergence of the beginnings of what will become Gnosticism, the attempt to try and escape from this anxious world. Remember, we talked about Gnosticism. All of that's happening, but there's something else that happens. What happens is philosophia and wisdom go through a transformation. What happens is a new addition, a new dimension to wisdom. It's consistent, it's continuous, and it's a development out of the old Socratic, Platonic, even Socratic Platonic model. But it's something new. This new metaphor emerges that hasn't existed before. This is the idea that the philosopher is the physician of the soul, of the psyche. That one of the main jobs of wisdom is to alleviate the anxiety of the domicile, of the meaning crisis of the Hellenistic era. So you have Epicurus saying, call no man a philosopher who has not alleviated the suffering of others. This therapeutic aspect starts to take root. Now, this is important because it tells us, right, about there were religious responses, yes, but it tells us about a non-religious response to a civilization-wide meaning crisis that might give us some insight into how we could also perhaps pursue a non-religious, philosophical response to the meaning crisis. And we'll take that up a week from now because there's no class on that. When we talk about Stoicism and the philosophy, the Hellenistic response to the Hellenistic meaning crisis. Thank you for your time, guys.